Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. Today, we are going to talk about a private shielded path to better payments, or alternate title, hard forking the payments timeline to better protect our personal data. So I gave this presentation at Zec Summit back in July and was asked by Josh from the ECC to share it to this broader platform. Really, really excited to be here today. Been a fan of Zcash for a long time, as you'll see. Um, I was asked at the Zec Summit to give an overview of what we're building at Flexa and why we think it's important to the future of payments. This presentation is going to be a little bit more personal than most presentations that I've given because privacy is honestly a huge part of why I am doing what I'm doing and why Flexa does what we do. And so I'll start with speaking a little bit about me. Then I'll share three discoveries we've made over the course of our journey here at Flexa, talk about why payments need privacy, and opine a little bit on what happens next. So, about me, my career so far is really this 15-year preoccupation with getting to the bottom of why payments are so broken. A lot of people would probably call this just working from first principles, but to me, it's more like a giant machete-driven journey through this incredibly unforgiving and confounding jungle of pre-internet decisions that have somehow been haunting us and come to undergird our entire global society for the last 75 years. And so, as you'll see, a lot of what we do here at Flexa is organized around trying to make sense of that mess and ultimately helping to rebuild commerce on top of a more solid and sensible foundation. And profession-wise, despite my title, I would consider myself more of a designer. I've always had a preoccupation with how people interact with technology, and specifically how they do so at all different scales. So, thinking from city scale and urban planning, all the way to building scale and architecture, down to screen scale for apps and GUIs. During my undergrad career, I thought I wanted to go into academia, and so I started to work at the MIT Media Lab. I found that my research there wasn't really connected to anything that actually shipped. We had all these amazing sponsors, but they cared more really about the marketing blip that they were getting from being associated with the lab than the output and the work we were building itself. So at that point, I moved to New York to join a branding agency. There, I worked for a bunch of different large businesses, including American Express. Amex was one of my clients for a few years. They eventually brought me in-house to help design the UI for a big data project. And it was at Amex that I really discovered that credit cards as a business are really just a race to the bottom. And that race to the bottom is engineered to distract shareholders from the fact that everything is truly held together by bubblegum and duct tape. Behind the scenes, everything at every credit card company, most payments companies, is really just a mess of very, very old code and hacks and patches and bubblegum and duct tape covering up bugs. So a few years at Amex, I actually quit to start my own payments company. A few years later, sold that company to another payments company, worked there for a while, and then 7 years ago started Flexa. And we started Flexa because we had observed this somewhat counterintuitive discovery. And we would call this discovery number one, which is that most of what we call payments today has very little to do with actually moving money. For example, VisaNet, the network behind Visa, is really just like LinkedIn messages. They represent payments, and a payment is an agreement between a buyer and a seller, but nothing related to actually moving money moves through this VisaNet system when we authorize a payment at a point of sale. That is not known to most people, but a very interesting reason for why we have blockchains. And blockchains are incredible at moving money, but they're pretty lousy for payments. So if you think of things like opaque transaction IDs or the inability to process refunds or standardized exchange rates that aren't actually standardized because there are so many different markets or order books backing all of these different digital currency exchanges. You think about the difference between pseudonymity versus identity and the idea that when we're making a digital currency payment, we're actually pushing funds, whereas when we're making a retail payment with our credit card or even a check, merchants are pulling funds from our accounts. All of these things make blockchains amazing at moving money, but pretty lousy for payments. And we have a nice diagram that we sometimes pull up at Flexa to really illustrate the contrast of this and show where we think things are going, which is to say that when we look at the main difference between credit cards and cryptocurrency, we can arrange them on this 2 by 2 grid. And credit cards, we would consider, are very good at facilitating payments, but bad at moving money. Cryptocurrency is great at moving money, but horrible at facilitating payments. And so then the questions are, what lives in the other boxes? The bad at moving money and horrible at facilitating payments box, that's very easy. You could think of things like rocks or bunnies. What we're really curious about is what's great at moving money and great at facilitating payments. And one of our big bets is that it has been 75 years of credit cards, but many fewer years of cryptocurrency. And so the likelihood that credit cards move into that box versus cryptocurrency moving into that box seems very, very low. We're putting our money on the idea that credit cards have a 100-year shelf life. We're 75 years in, we have maybe 20 years to go. Let's get cryptocurrency into the spot where it's great at facilitating payments because it's already great at moving money. And so Flexa is really about these three things. It's about building a bridge from the way that payments have worked for 75 years to this new era of payments that's pretty much inevitable at this point. And our mission at Flexa is really about helping sellers to thrive in this new era of commerce, which to us means universal access to commerce and as little personal data as possible. So this is easier said than done. We decided really early on that Flexa could be most helpful as a protocol level piece of infrastructure as opposed to competing for customers with a consumer-focused app or trying to build a new blockchain ourselves. And so Flexa sits at the center of this really nice Venn diagram, kind of the sweet spot of payments infrastructure, but without using cards. And the trouble with this chart, if you can't already tell, is that unless you're a self-custody wallet, or a standard, or a blockchain, the infrastructure for moving money between buyers and sellers always requires licenses. And licenses always require some degree of centralization, and centralization skews the value chain. And so here was where we made another important and counterintuitive discovery about payments, which is that better payments means centering on sellers. And what I mean by that is that we tend to think of traditional payments, like credit card and debit card payments, as consumer-focused, but in reality, they're more issuer-focused, issuer being a bank, for example. And earlier, we talked about how credit cards don't really move money, and that's because they're not designed to move money. In fact, it's really the opposite. As credit instruments, they're designed to carry a balance, and that balance collects interests. And then that brings about these really perverse incentives around how credit cards get us to spend money we don't actually have. And it's like kind of how in Vegas, the house always wins, except the house is the banking system, and we're all playing a game of cards and points against each other. There's one particularly glaring example of the absolutely bonkers brokenness of payments that I used to spend a lot of time explaining to people before I found this very nice author at Vox who wrote it all down in a very accessible way. Emily Stewart wrote this article about the ugly truth behind your rewards credit card. And the gist of it, and I recommend everyone go and find this article because it's fantastic. The gist of it is that high-value credit cards are not evenly distributed. And in fact, because FICO scores were invented in the 1950s, a lot of the classism, sexism, and racism that was prevalent at the time was just directly entrenched into this system of who can access credit card payments via FICO scores. Except that someone has to pay for those airline miles and loyalty points. And so it turns out that these points just get charged directly to the merchants and then baked into the cost of everything that we as consumers buy. Worse still, because low rewards cards cost merchants less than high reward cards, it's the people who can't get approved for these fancy credit cards who end up paying a disproportionate share of the fees. And that effectively creates this tax, as Ms. Stewart argues, that $700 per year moves from individuals who aren't credit worthy, and that eventually forms a bonus of about $1,000 per year to the rich, affluent, mostly male, mostly white people who FICO says are credit worthy. And so we end up with these private companies in Visa and MasterCard who are effectively working against most merchants and against most consumers to entrench this system that is really benefiting the issuing banks who govern Visa and MasterCard. And at Flexa, we don't think that that makes a lot of long-term sense. We actually don't think that there's anyone better placed to make decisions about the costs of payments than the people who are actually selling the things. So we are building modern payments infrastructure with sellers at the center. We really think that payments should be a public good, a public utility, backed by these distributed ledger technologies, and really open to everyone. And we think that starting with merchants is the best way to achieve that. And that leads us to discovery number 3, which is that you can't build better crypto payments by starting from crypto. I've seen this happen enough times, and I think we'll all agree or have examples of this that we can think about as I'm going into this. I'm sure someone's made it into a razor by now, but the idea is that you always have to approach tech adoption from the perspective of what came first. So, for example, Amazon led us to ebooks, but they really just started as this online bookseller. Netflix pulled movies into the internet, but they built that incredible infrastructure to deliver DVDs through the mail first. And Stripe's mission has been to increase the GDP of the internet, but they really started by embracing the horrible parts of card processing and then abstracted it into a simple API. I really like the quote from Steve Jobs about this, which is probably the most famous quote in this arena, which is that you've got to start with the customer experience and work backwards to the technology. You can't start with the technology and then try to figure out where you're going to sell it. I think that too much of what we see in crypto is about forcing blockchain paradigms onto people who are accustomed to the old way of moving money, and it just doesn't connect. It doesn't work. As an example, one of the other crypto payment providers out there literally has this slider in their dashboard, and the slider lets you choose between high-risk, high-speed payments and low-risk, low-speed payments. And it's like the Sophie's choice of payments, right? No merchant wants to make the choice between high risk or low speed. By the way, it's totally understandable why they did that. Bitcoin payments are too slow to work, but instead at Flexa, we spend a ton of our time starting from the seller's perspective and trying to approach crypto from that regard. And it's things like, yes, I want fast payments, but I also can't get hit by replace by fee attacks or 51% attacks. Or yes, I want to accept digital assets, but I also need to be paid in US dollars. Oh, and I can't be exposed to price volatility because it will screw up my taxes. It's because of this that we have really nailed the enterprise market for digital currency acceptance. And at last count, of all of the Fortune 500 companies who are accepting digital currencies, all of them use our products except for one, which is Tesla, because of course they built it themselves. But to get there, to do that, we've built all of these incredible and completely cardless, by the way, payments technologies, including our network approval engine, multiplayer payments coming, this app list, open source database of wallet information and wallet interface content. We have also spent a number of person hours trying to build out a better interface for payments, such as what we call payment clips, which really distill a cryptocurrency transaction down to 3 important aspects. It is the merchant you are paying, not some opaque wallet address. It is the actual amount you see on the point of sale, and it is the currency you're using to pay that. We have spent a lot of time figuring out how to implement things like perpetual acceptance, which is this idea that you can sit on a page for hours and hours and hours, and we don't have to ever show you a 15-second countdown timer because we can roll quotes in the background and we can always surface you with the latest quote when you're ready to make a payment. And we can honor a set of past quotes so that we make sure that you don't end up getting bumped into some kind of a race condition. And on top of all this is the Flexa SDK that we launched and went live with in the Zashi app last fall. Just like how we approach payments from the perspective of the seller, we've met with a bunch of wallet app developers over the last several years, and we found that there were several things related to making payments work that were just a little bit too cumbersome or onerous for wallet developers to implement. So we've built out this series of components, the spend component, the scan component, and more components coming soon to hopefully make wallet developers' lives a lot easier. Okay. So where does Zcash come in? Well, Flexa works really hard to be asset agnostic because we really think sellers should have the freedom to accept whatever asset they like. But we are very long-time fans of Zcash. It was the second asset that we added after our launch. We were early supporters of the crypto community project. We helped throw Zcash's 4th birthday party back in 2020. We've hosted events together at Consensus and other conferences. Zashi was the first wallet to launch the Flexa SDK and enable in-person payments at places like Chipotle, GameStop, Ulta Beauty, Regal, for Zec users in the US. But also, I have this hypothesis that Bitcoin and to a lesser extent Ethereum today are not really fulfilling Satoshi's version or Satoshi's vision, I should say, of electric and electronic cash. And I should say, first of all, that even Vitalik agrees with me. To do payments well, cash needs to do two things. It needs to be really cheap to send, and it needs to be fast. And of course, it needs to be secure and final, and lots of other things that Bitcoin and Ethereum do exceptionally well. But you really can't have cash without cheap and fast. And on the fast front, there's been lots of great progress over the years in the form of scaling solutions and layer twos, and I think both Bitcoin and EVM have a lot to offer here. But when it comes to cost, there's just no question in my mind that low fees are not an ultimate priority of either of those chains. And here we have a chart of transaction fees demonstrating the difference between Bitcoin's average transaction fees over the years and Ethereum's. The reason that you don't see any other colors on this chart is because all of the other chains are at zero, effectively. And in fact, within our UI, when we present network fees to customers, the only chains that really ever pop up with non-zero, or I should say, greater than 1 penny transaction fees are Bitcoin and Ethereum. And Zcash is one of those chains. We believe that there's already a lot of common ground between what Zcash cares about and what Flexa cares about when it comes to enabling payments for merchants. And that partly explains why we've had such a fun time working together over the years. But there's also the fact that payments today, and this is going to be obvious, are so horrifically invasive when it comes to privacy. I love this meme. Many people, although perhaps not those of us attending Zcon, many people don't really think about this in the course of day-to-day payments. But that's really because we've already handed over all of our personal information in the form of a credit card application or when we were opening up our first bank account. You really can't participate in a cashless society today without everything getting tracked against your identity. And that is still not enough to secure a single payment, especially when payments started to move online. For example, have you ever thought about where billing addresses come from? I don't have this as anything but apocryphal, but my understanding of how billing addresses came about is that a developer or a project team was trying to find a way to fight the onset of fraud that they were seeing when people were starting to use credit cards online. And so they went into the database of information they had about their credit cards, and they found billing addresses. And anyone who has ever tried to design a payments acceptance form knows that those 7 or 8 fields that everyone now has to fill out whenever we're filling out a billing address are not only hard for customers to use, they're also hard to develop. And that is obviously pretty ridiculous. We just picked a billing address, almost like a 2-step form of authentication, and it just doesn't work. The hackers who were using card numbers and expiration dates and CVVs before just started adding billing addresses to their databases and so selling those off instead. And that's led to EMV 2.0 and 3D Secure and whatnot. We don't have to get into that right now. Obviously, this is all ridiculous. So at Flexa, we actually went to the individual laws that govern payments. That includes the Bank Secrecy Act, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, the Patriot Act. We went to these laws to figure out the minimum information that companies are required to collect in order to process payments, both in the US and around the globe. And we built our entire onboarding flow around that. And we currently enable anyone to spend up to $750 a week just by providing a name and a birth date. We don't require cell phone numbers. We don't require social security numbers. We don't require billing addresses. In the states where we're required to do so, we do aggregate and report transaction volume based on what Cloudflare tells us are requests, probable city, and zip, but we don't store IP addresses. It's not possible for merchants to correlate any of this information from one transaction to any other transaction. Favorite story about that, by the way, is the story of a father whose daughter started receiving mail from Target. And the mail was insinuating that the daughter was pregnant. And the father was very, very upset that Target was trying to sell diapers to his daughter. And so he called up and complained to customer support. And about a week later, he had to call back and apologize for being so loud and obnoxious because his daughter was actually pregnant. And the joke here is that Target found out about his daughter being pregnant before he did. And that's because Target was comparing all the things that she was buying on the family credit card from transaction to transaction because they could track them against the credit card numbers. And we at Flexa absolutely do not allow that to happen because every single transaction that someone makes using Flexa is completely pseudonymous. It's completely unique and random and not possible to be compared to any other transaction. And by the way, we index and publicly post all of the times we've received government information requests or been obligated to provide any personal data in this annual transparency report that we publish. I think, I know I've been kind of waxing about different aspects of this here, but the bottom line is that crypto is not credit. And in fact, crypto makes it impossibly easy to prove that someone is good for a payment. You don't need a credit line. You don't need a credit score. We just don't need to process any personal data in order to help people pay for things. And yet, many of the approaches that we're taking with adopting or encouraging widespread adoption of digital currency have to do with plugging crypto into a credit or a debit card. If I were to jump in a time machine and find out that 25 years from now, we're still sucking up personal information just to help make the credit card networks whole, I would be very, very disappointed. And that is what we are very, very focused on here at Flexa. So at Flexa, we like to say that we have a 25-year roadmap for building a better payment system for sellers. We are trying to hard fork payments before another century goes by and we're still using plastic and metal cards for everything. If that happens, I think then it is very likely that AI will take care of us all, but hopefully it doesn't come to that. In the immediate term, we are just working on building the best acceptance tools for merchants and the best payment tools to help developers interface with those merchant acceptance interfaces. And then we have recently released a Flex SDK that helps wallets interface directly with in-person and online points of sale. Very, very proud that the Zashi app and the Nighthawk wallet app in the Zcash ecosystem have both adopted that SDK. Our vision really, though, in that sense is twofold. One, we want to see broader adoption of digital currencies for payments. And then two, we just want to make sure that we don't repeat the same mistakes of the last 75 years. We think that adoption entails more people using crypto, oftentimes without knowing that they're using crypto. And I think this is inevitable, by the way. The UI is going to obfuscate the fact that it's crypto behind the scenes, just like the UI of our web browsers drops the HTTPS because that's no longer really relevant to the vast majority of customers. In terms of avoiding mistakes, though, this bullet number 2, we think that payments need to shift away from being issuer-centric and toward being seller-centric. We think they need to shift off of cards and into apps. And we think they need to shift from being secured by personal data to being secured by blockchains. And obviously, this is going to require a lot of thoughtful work and patience. But really, in terms of my hopes and dreams for Zcash and Flexa, I would love to see a thriving Zcash wallet and maybe even a shielded assets ecosystem. I'd love to see a significant number of payments taking place on Zcash versus other chains. I'd like to see promotional tie-ins with big merchants offering discounts to people paying with Zec. And I think that with the Zashi wallet and other efforts along these lines, we are all well on the way. So I hope you've learned a little bit about Flexa today and what we're trying to achieve for the Zcash ecosystem and for crypto on the whole. In summary, we are all about helping sellers thrive in the next era of commerce. And that means universal access to commerce, means fast payments and payouts, and as little personal data as possible. Again, I am Trevor. I am one of our co-founders, and I am so grateful for you taking the time to attend this session today. Thank you very much, and have a great rest of your conference.